continuing in a series based on questions that you asked. A few months ago, I asked everyone over the course of a couple of Sundays to write down on index cards any questions or topics that you wish we talked about in church, but for one reason or another, never felt comfortable bringing up. We've been moving through some especially juicy ones lately. We had violence and then sex. And this week, the topic relates to addiction. The question that came to us is this, and it's in your bulletin as well. What does harm reduction work look like in community? How do we keep each other safe from the things we do to ourselves to cope in this really rough lifetime, supporting each other through addiction, mental health, sickness, and grief? I do like to pause and just ask if the person who asked this wants to say anything more about the question, but there's no obligation to. Okay. I love a question that contains its own answer. What does harm reduction work look like in community? How do we keep each other safe from the things we do to ourselves to cope in this really rough lifetime? In community, how do we support each other through addiction, mental health, and sickness and grief? In community. We hear that word a lot, community. It's become kind of a buzzword. Maybe we say it and we hear it more than we talk about what it means. I think Jessica Baker said it best, and she said, I could quote her a few weeks ago, I hope it's still okay. The cost of community is annoyance and inconvenience. Community means showing up for each other, not because we always want to, but because that's the commitment we've made to one another. Showing up not just for the best of each other, not just for the good, but also for the worst of ourselves and each other. And also not just out of some misguided sense that we're showing up to help someone, but because we understand deeply that we need as much as we have to give. Because there is a worst in each of us. There is a part of each of us that is inconvenient to others. And every human being yearns for and deserves to have other people who are committed to dealing with the annoyance and inconvenience that comes with being in community with them. This question was about harm reduction, which, if you don't know, is language related to addiction. Harm reduction is an approach to addiction recovery that says that if you can't give up something you're addicted to all at once, the most important thing is to make sure that you are safe as long as you are using. Proponents, advocates of harm reduction, organize spaces that are sanitary and comfortable and warm and supervised, places with community. And a lot of people criticize harm reduction. They say it's a half measure. They say that the only cure for addiction is complete and immediate sobriety. You've just got to stop. And that this practice of harm reduction is enabling, and even that it's dangerous. Those critics fail to understand two things. First, they fail to understand that most addiction is fueled by stress. People don't get addicted to things that they're addicted to because they're happy and fulfilled, right? Addiction is a coping mechanism. And most of that stress is rooted in feelings of fear and shame. Addiction is just the symptom of a deeper dis-ease, and fear and shame are that dis-ease. So bringing people struggling with addiction into a space where they are seen and accepted, where they are safe, and where they are treated with warmth, in short, where they are in community, that is a treatment for addiction. maybe the treatment for addiction, because it's one that attacks the root cause of the dis-ease instead of just its symptoms. The second thing that those critics fail to understand is that the disease of a person with an addiction is in fact a universal human dis-ease. And it has been since the very beginning. The first book of the Bible, Genesis, starts with a story about two humans and how they came to feel fear and shame. A fear of a mistake that they had made, which led them to hide from God in shame. A lot of people think that this story about the quote-unquote original sin is about what Adam and Eve did and how it was wrong and how they shouldn't have done it. I think it's at least as much, if not more, about the dis-ease that follows what happened. What made the fruit forbidden to them wasn't something about the fruit itself. The problem was the inevitable consequence that God knew would come from eating it, that it would create a permanent separation between them and God. What matters is that eating that fruit led to those feelings of fear and shame that made the fullness of God's goodness and love inaccessible to those humans. And every human born after them, with the exception of one, has inherited that dis-ease of believing that they are fundamentally unworthy of love and acceptance. We all express that dis-ease in different ways. Some have visible addictions that are recognized as addictions, but there are so many other ways to act out. And in all of those ways, we are trying to gain control over that feeling that we are unlovable and unacceptable. Instead of just accepting God's love, we try to control the love of others. And often the things that we do to hide our fear and our shame and to try to even cure them of our own will are the very same things that keep us entrenched in that fear and that shame. Let me give you two examples. Think of the workaholic, maybe even a workaholic father, someone who believes that if he can provide for his family, they will love him. But since he's at work so much, he's unavailable to them. He misses dinners and games, and when he's home, he's too tired to parent his kids the way they want to be parented or to be romantic with his partner. This leads to resentments. He feels his family's resentments, and so he works even harder to prove his worthiness to be loved. It becomes a self-destructive cycle, fueled by fear and shame, creating fear and shame. Or think about the freelance graphic designer, someone who gives away her time and talents to her friends. She keeps taking on her friends' projects and says that her friends can underpay her, or even that they don't have to pay her at all. And she's behind on her rent, and she can't pay her bills. But she is so scared that people will hate her if she asks them to start paying for the work that she's doing for them. It would make her feel like a bad person. Feel that fear and shame, the same fear and shame that she's trying to cure by giving so much away. She never asks for help, and she never gets it. The things that we do to cope with fear and shame are the very same things, oftentimes, that entrench it more deeply. We come by these coping mechanisms honestly. Usually it's because we saw a caretaker modeling them. We saw that overworking or under-earning, and we've just learned to cope the same way. It's not our fault, and we deserve to recover. In the language of Christianity, what's happening here is that we all have sin. And our natural strategy, the the strategy that we come up with of our free wills for getting out of that pattern of sin is to sin even harder. In the language of addiction recovery, what's grounding the question today, what's happening in all these different examples is that the person has come to believe that the same thing that is ruining their life is the only thing that can save them. There's a misconception that the opposite of addiction is sobriety, but that's not right. The opposite of addiction is actually connection. And there's some really fascinating science behind this. The traditional understanding of addiction, which has probably gotten into your brain one way or another, comes from a famous experiment where rats were put into cages, one rat per cage, and each cage had 2 water tanks. One of the water tanks had plain water in it, and the other water tank had water that was laced with cocaine. Almost 100% of the time, rats would choose the cocaine water and become addicted to it. They would escalate their consumption of the cocaine water, they would work harder to obtain it, and they would take increasingly greater risks to obtain it. The conclusion of these experiments is that rats have an addictive personality. You've probably heard that term. And anyone who uses a drug will become addicted to it because they have an addictive personality. In 1996, someone was looking at this famous experiment and they had an epiphany. They thought, maybe the problem isn't the rats or the cocaine. Maybe the problem is the cage. So this scientist recreated the experiment. But instead of one rat alone in one cage, he created a vast cage full of toys and puzzles and lots of other rats. He called it Rat Park. The rats could exercise, they could play, they could eat, they could have all the sex that they wanted. And he also put the 2 water tanks in Rat Park, one with cocaine and one without cocaine. The rats in this experiment weren't interested in the cocaine. Even the ones who drank the cocaine water didn't show signs of being addicted to it. This experiment, almost 30 years ago, started a new science of addiction, which claims that addiction is environmental. It is not chemical. When people have what they need to mitigate their fear and their shame in healthy ways, they don't need to cope with behaviors and substances that actually make the dis-ease worse in the long run. Which brings us back into community. The opposite of addiction is connection. To put the same idea more theologically, the opposite of sin is love. We all bring messiness into community. A lot of us try hard to hide that messiness. Maybe because we're afraid that people will reject us if they really see us. Maybe because we have this misguided feeling that we need to show up for other people's messiness, but that means we don't get to be messy ourselves. A lot of church folks feel this way. We're here because we want to be helpful people, because that's what makes us good people, because that's what makes us worthy of being loved and accepted. It's just a coping mechanism. Unfortunately, we are also here because of a man named Jesus who didn't have time for people with that kind of attitude. Jesus spent his time on earth with the sinners and the tax collectors, the messiest of messy people. When he was criticized for this, he doubled down. He said, "I came not to heal the healthy, but to heal the sick." Jesus' point wasn't that some people don't need him or don't deserve him. Jesus' point was that it was only people who recognize their dis-ease who can make themselves available for the cure that he has. We need community, both for what we can give to it and for what we can get from it. It has to be that two-way street. And if it's not inconvenient and annoying, then we're probably not doing it right. But it's the gift that Jesus gave us that makes us able to minister and to receive the healing and the wholeness that every single one of us desperately needs. Nobody ever stopped sinning because somebody told them to stop sinning. Nobody ever stopped feeling shame or fear because somebody told them not to feel that way. We recover slowly and together by creating spaces where we can keep coming back to encounter the love and the acceptance of God through one another. Spaces where we know we won't be judged, where we will be safe, and where we can be gentle with one another. In other words, spaces where we can practice harm reduction. Thanks be to God.